Welcome back to our final support session on the TA assessment topic. This one we're going to be covering off the topic of actually conducting the assessment once you've written your assessment tools, and then the all-important assessment trial review, which normally happens after you've conducted and done a bit of an in-field trial with the assessment tools that you've written. The steps shown on the screen here kind of summarise what the process is that you would use to make sure that you're effectively conducting an assessment, and we'll go through these in a bit more detail shortly. Essentially, the biggest tip really is to ensure that when you are working with the students, that sometimes the concept of assessment can be quite stressful, and therefore it's really important to make sure that you are very sensitive to potential needs that the student might have around the timing and how fast or quick things are done, and that you are then therefore able to ensure that you can really be mindful that some students may have special needs or may suffer some sort of anxiety around the concept of assessment. So gently as she goes, and communication is key really when you're planning and making everyone aware of what's required around assessment. So the first part of our steps just talks about referring to your original assessment plan, just to make sure that as the assessor that you do understand what all the components are. So there can often be many moving parts when you're doing assessment. It isn't always just in one nice neat document, and you may be required to not just conduct the assessment that you're involved in directly, but there could be activities that relate to third parties. So you might do your knowledge assessment, you might do your observation of the student, and then they might go into the workforce and have to collect evidence in a logbook showing what hours they've completed, or they might have a supervisor watch them do activities in different areas over time. So those different extra items should all be listed in your assessment plan, so that you, the assessor, know what exactly you're going to be rounding up at the end of the process to be making your decision around competency. It will also be important that you really go through what those moving parts are with your student as well, so they know that it's not just one knowledge test. It may be a combination of different activities on that. Certainly your compliance manager within the RTO is your point of call to make sure that you are 100% across something before you go out there and get going, because the last thing you want is to conduct what you believe is the required assessment activities and then tell your student that they're all done and they're okay and they're competent, and then realise that there was some additional requirements that you were supposed to be in charge of as well. You need to make sure that you have all your resources. So can't stress enough that all that planning around everything is really important. So it may not be that you just need to have the actual assessment tool itself. You might need to have materials or equipment, or book a room, or have any sort of resources that relate to actually conducting that assessment. It might involve other people. So again, in your assessment plan, it will often say who else is involved in the assessment itself. But certainly there could be quite a little pack of things that you need to organise by way of resources when you're conducting your assessment. These should all be listed in the assessment plan. So you can start to see why there's so many little fields in that single page document, because it's really a pre-think to make sure that you don't forget anything if you're going out on site particularly. You may also require some specialist support. So this could be to do with your individual students who may have particular needs that you need to have extra specialists involved in the assessment process. There's a few examples of that on the screen. So if you're dealing with English as a second language, you may involve interpreters or special educators, or you might have to involve a regulatory authority if it's something to do with a licensing outcome. So really, again, as the subject matter expert, these sorts of things do need to be thought through prior, so that there's not like a big rush at the end where you have to round up people that may not be available. Very, very important to make sure that you discuss, explain, and confirm acknowledgement with your candidates about what they have to do to be part of their assessment process. So don't just assume they know because you know. So really take the time to really make sure they understand. I'd often do this at the beginning, even before you start the training side of things, and really talk about what the end game is all about with the assessment, and make sure they feel ready before they just get launched into doing their assessment side of things. Remember to be fair and equitable, and with some students that may mean being a bit flexible around the timings or the extensions permitted to ensure that the assessment requirements are completed successfully for all parties. The next topic is about gathering quality evidence. So this is making sure that you're using the correct tools, and they must be the correct version of the correct tools. So always make sure that there's a version control situation happening within the learning environment. Make sure that you're efficient, don't get them doing more things than what they have to do, and make sure that where possible you can gather the evidence in as close to the real world environment as possible. And that will just give you a better quality evidence outcome, because really then you're watching people, particularly if they're doing their tasks in the real world, you're watching them in a workplace that's not perfect. Whereas just being in a plain old classroom where there isn't a simulated environment set up, it's never going to be the same as the real world. So be impartial and fair, and make sure that there's no biases around the results that you assign once you've started doing your evidence collection. Ensuring that you integrate quality activities kind of follows on from that. Make sure that they complete the overall work task, not just one little single part of it, because that's not how things would happen in the real world. So really think about your assessment process, and where possible, look at an end-to-end correctly sequenced work activity, and make sure that you can involve different tasks where possible so that they can be assessed holistically. So again, we talked about this a little bit earlier with our other assessment support sessions, where we mentioned that quite often there'll be units of competency that just go together because they go together in the real world, whatever their tasks and topics are. So where possible, if you can combine actual observations around doing end-to-end work activities, that will give you a better quality outcome. Making sure that any document changes are done only, I guess, in accordance with the RTO compliance procedures. So you can't just on the day decide that if the observation says you must observe 3 times, that you think, oh, I'm running out of time, so I'll just do it twice. There's really important rules and regulations that go behind the reasons why assessment requirements may be a certain way. So really important that you don't just wing it, and you always use the assessment tool provided, and that any variation or change has to be approved in most cases. So there would be then a version change, and normally changes and improvements only really happen at periodical times within the RTO, where they look at feedback from everybody, not just a one-off thing that may make it I guess a bit better on the day. You really need to have a more systematic approach to document changes, and making sure that that version control program is in place. The concept of ASQA continuously requiring validation is part of the standards for RTOs. So it's really saying that you don't just set and forget with your assessment tools, that you have to have a continuous improvement, systematic approach to ensuring that the results and the feedback related to all training products is continuously validated on a set cycle. And also evidence of any quality improvement is kept on file. So that's normally making sure that there's some sort of a feedback form that's completed at the end of the assessment process. So you might collect student feedback or trainer feedback or employer feedback, those sorts of stakeholders that are involved in the process. And that as part of that, you can then summarise what worked, what could be improved, and here's what we've done to change it. So you might then have a version change as a result. But you keep records of all these improvement processes, and that way the regulator can see that you do have this continuous improvement process happening. Supporting the candidate, we've touched on already. So it's really making sure that you are giving your candidate a fair chance of completing the task successfully. So you would only have a stop-start approach if there was any issues around safety, or if you feel that the candidate is just not ready once you start. So if you get them going, doing a task, and you can see that they really need a bit more practice before they can do it successfully, don't put them through the pain of it. You should end the assessment at that point and then continue with some gap training to make sure that you are giving your candidate the best chance of success. You don't want to set them up to fail. And then at the end of completing all the evidence gathering, then you make the assessment decision. So you have to firstly make sure you have all individual components of evidence as stipulated in your original assessment plan, and that when you conduct your marking of the assessment, that you have used the model answers or the marker's guide around what competence looks like in terms of either knowledge responses or behaviours in your observation or characteristics of projects or portfolio items. So all those things that you would have gone through with your student that describes what competence looks like should be found within your model answers or markers guides. So you must always mark in accordance with that. And then once you've got all the evidence together, you would then make a decision of competent or not yet competent. And if it's the latter with the not yet competent, then you need to make sure that you are very clear with the candidate what the gap is that they have to produce for you or demonstrate for you to be able to then be taken from not yet competent to competent. So resubmission is quite a standard process of learning within the vet sector. So adults learn well when they are given good feedback that explains what wasn't correct when they complete something, and then they get the opportunity to redo it when they're ready and they've practiced the correct behaviours or the correct activities, and then they can be marked competent. So either way, there should always be feedback to the candidate with any follow-up action plan required if there's a resubmission requirement. And then the final part to it is this record keeping. So ASQA does need information retained by the RTO for 30 years about the outcome. So that doesn't mean you've got to keep every single little piece of evidence, but you do need to retain on file securely what the outcome is, so that if the student needs a certificate reissued or there's some other query down the track for that period of 30 years, that the RTO can produce the outcome and has the information. So it'll be things like the dates that the unit of competency was deemed as being competent, and that would usually be kept electronically in a student management system. When it comes to the actual pieces of paper, so the physical evidence items that are collected by the assessor during the assessment process, the ASQA website has I think it's a general direction that states that these items must be kept for a period of 6 months post the end of the assessment process, or the appeals period, I think, whichever is the greater. And that means that if a student isn't happy with the result that's been assigned, they do have time to come back and have their evidence reviewed by another assessor. After that 6-month period, those individual evidence items can be destroyed. Now, it's not always possible to keep some evidence items for that 6-month period. So, for example, if you're in hospitality and your evidence was making an actual food item, it may be that you just keep a photograph of it instead of the actual food item. That can also be different with the time evidence is retained when there is a state government funding contract in place, and you should always refer to that contract details because they will often have a longer period of time for the retention of the individual evidence items. Once the decision has been made and the file has been updated, these results must be recorded promptly and accurately. So typically, any certificate has to be issued within 30 days of completion of the final unit of competency. So it's really good practice to aim to have your results submitted and feedback completed and all those other little associated activities done within that same time frame. And then sometimes it requires an assessment report if there is an RTO policy about the overall results of the group or such. So the assessment reporting is really making sure that you have a template set up that will capture all this sort of information. So it's the full legal name of the candidate and the date the assessment was made and the assessor and details around the RTO, the unit that's involved and the overall outcome, the competent or not yet competent, plus signatures, and then sometimes there would be additional comments on file if required. and often there is a file reference. So sometimes there may be some sort of in-house file reference number. So if we have a look at what that looks like with the template that's been provided, I'll just grab a copy of that and drag it across. So in your little assessment kit, there's a couple of different documents. So one of them looks like this, and it says completion of competency record. So this is an actual student file that has been marked. So it involved 2 separate evidence items. So one was a knowledge test and one was an observation checklist. It states what the unit code and title was. It signs off that the evidence was directly related to the unit of competency and fully covering the unit of competency. There was enough evidence that it was the true work of the candidate and that it shows the skills are currently held. There's feedback to the student, and then there's a final outcome and a date. And then it's been signed off by both the student and the assessor and also an observer. So to make sure that that is correct, there's also a requirement to then have copies of the individual assessment pieces. So firstly, we've got the knowledge assessment. Again, there's instructions, there's an outcome. There was some educational adjustments made, and there's some details about that. There's feedback to the student and a sign-off. And then there's the actual knowledge assessment itself, which has been marked. And then there's an observation checklist, same story. So again, observation checklist and instructions. There's also feedback notes to the student. So it just has a little pointer there to say, make sure to introduce yourself to co-workers, well done otherwise. So it's really just providing a bit of additional enhancement for the next time. But it certainly still met the satisfactory requirement. The reason why individual pieces of evidence, so this is the observation checklist, are not shown as competent, not yet competent, is that one individual evidence item, so just the observation checklist or just the knowledge test on their own, cannot lead to a decision of competence for the entire unit. So they are only assessing certain parts of the unit. So one is assessing knowledge and one is assessing skill. So you can't deem someone competent if you only have one half of the assessment evidence requirements. So you mark the individual evidence as being satisfactory or not satisfactory only. So then in our observation checklist, we've got signatures and dates to show what was occurred. And again, you've got these very clear little behaviours that have happened there. So that piece of evidence and then the knowledge piece of evidence goes together with this cover sheet, and that's what's submitted to the RTO. So those items together, all dated and signed, would be exactly what's required to sign off that student as being competent for that one unit of competency. And that forms part of the reporting. So again, every RTO will have their own templates around their cover sheets and their assessment instructions and information collected, but quite important to not miss signature areas or to not, don't forget to put dates on them. All those minor details, you'll have a very cranky compliance person if they're not followed. So then once you've actually completed the assessment, there should then be some process of review. Now, it doesn't have to happen after every single assessment. It may well be that you get the opportunity to ask for feedback from the candidate at the end of each course. It may not be after each individual unit, but certainly if you feel that that's important, you're more than welcome to have different touch points for collecting feedback. So the feedback would come from people like your trainer assessor. So it mentions on the screen there that self-reflection is one form of review where the assessor kind of looks back on the process and says, you know, what worked, what didn't work, did I have enough time, were the questions clear, did I get good responses with the results and things like that. But it can also be feedback from the candidate where they are asked very specifically what they felt about the assessment process. And then all of those sorts of feedback channels are all channeled into one central point where you'll have someone who takes responsibility for collecting all these different feedback from different stakeholders, and there's quite a few other ones shown on the screen there. They would then collect all that feedback and then put it into some sort of review template or analysis. So it may be as simple as a table which just says what went well, what could be improved, and asks a few questions about whether or not the activity met the requirements. And if not, what would you do differently? So it can be something simple like that, or it can be a more in-depth validation. So in the actual assessment kit, there's an assessment trial review, and this is essentially doing a post-implementation validation of the whole process and whether or not the actual tools themselves met those principles of assessment and rules of evidence. So this one here has been completed. You're essentially just putting in your unit of competency and the AQF level, what's the qualification it's coming out of and the date that the assessment occurred, who's involved in the actual review. So sometimes it's good to have more people than just one because you'll get different perspectives and different people's feedback from different angles. Then we can, again, determine what the assessment instruments and methods were. And then over on the next page down, we just have a whole big series of questions. And these questions are the same as if you were being audited by an ASCL representative. So when they come to visit and they are looking at your assessment practice and they're saying, you know, tell me about how you meet the principles of assessment with your assessment practice, you can say, well, here's our trial review or our validation of the process that we did for this unit when we first wrote the unit of competency. And these were all the questions that related to the topic of fairness. So that's things like, did we write the assessments to the correct AQF level? So we weren't writing questions that were too hard or too soft. Did we support the learner through the process? Were the timeframes realistic? So all of these characteristics and questions in here relate directly to this topic of fairness. So then you just go through and you tick yes or no as you go through, and you put comments in because the comments are really the parts that are going to give you value when it comes to looking at what we would do to change the assessment tool or process to make sure it's better for next time. So for example, in this one here where it says written language used on the written documentation intended for learners is clear and concise. So the group that were doing this validation, they felt that question 3 wasn't really covering the intent of what it was mapped to. So they were suggesting that it would be better to use images with the knowledge questioning around appropriate non-verbal communication because the question wasn't clear enough. So these are all the sorts of comments that you would typically find. So when you are doing your review after you have conducted your assessment marking with your students, then you would have to complete one of these and you can put in some examples of how you've managed to achieve the requirements here under the different principles and rules of evidence. But if there's anything that you feel should be changed, then you need to make sure that's noted. And then right at the very end, there's an action plan, and it would again reflect what was determined by the group regarding an actual change to a question. And then there would be a requirement to have a version update. So make sure that the RTO manager is then given the responsibility to fix these little tweaks, and they would have a time frame to have it done by, and then there would be some sort of finalising to close out those action items once they're done. And everyone would then get a copy of the new version to be used ongoing. So that's really in a nutshell, our assessment marking requirements and also how we do our assessment trial review. So once you've been through the process of conducting your assessment, certainly having a good reflection about what worked and what didn't work is going to be invaluable for your RTO to really continuously improve their processes around the actual assessment marking itself. Okay, well that concludes our final support session in relation to the assessment topic. I wish you well with your prac work now, and certainly goodbye and good luck.